I wasn't snooping. I wasn't even suspicious yet. That's the part that still feels unreal. It was a slow Thursday night, the kind where time crawls, and the walls hum with the kind of silence that makes you think everything's fine. My boyfriend Alan was out with his coworkers for just one drink. I was home doing what I usually did, folding his shirts, checking if the sheets were dry, making sure his favorite dinner leftovers were wrapped and ready in the fridge. The small invisible things you do when you love someone who says thank you without looking up from his phone. My laptop was charging in the bedroom, so I borrowed his. Just for a minute. I only needed to open a browser window to find a recipe, that's all. Then it happened, the sound. Ding. A small, harmless Facebook notification in the corner of the screen. Alan K. 22, new messages in Healing Hearts Anonymous. At first I smiled. I thought maybe it was some kind of men's support group. After his last breakup with his ex Sienna, he'd gone through therapy and online healing spaces. I was glad he still had an outlet. I really was. But then a preview line popped up beneath the title. He's nice, but honestly I'm just waiting for Sienna to come back. I stared at it, the cursor blinking on the screen, as if it were breathing in sync with my heart. Then I felt the smallest, sharpest chill at the base of my spine. It had to be a mistake, right? Maybe he commented on someone else's post. Maybe this wasn't his. But then I saw his name, Alan K., and his profile picture, the one from our anniversary trip last fall. The one where he'd held me under a string of fairy lights, smiling like forever meant something. The air thickened. I clicked. The page loaded, and there it was, a thread full of his words, his confessions, his jokes. Cindy's great, but she's not her. You know, I don't even feel anything anymore. It's like living in someone else's house. She tries so hard, bless her heart. I just don't have it in me. Each post was another cut. My eyes burned, but no tears came. I kept scrolling, reading comments from strangers, laughing emojis, bro. I get you, one woman writing. That poor girl probably thinks she's the one. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there frozen in a body that suddenly didn't belong to me. For nearly 3 years, I'd been the one steady thing in Alan's chaos. I met him after Sienna had shattered him, the ex who left him for a woman she'd met on a work trip. He was heartbroken, raw, humiliated. I had been the patient one, the one who listened, the one who held him through his panic attacks, helped him rebuild, encouraged him to go back to school to start over. I helped him find his footing. I celebrated his little wins. I even co-signed his lease when he said he couldn't afford a place alone. Every step I told myself love was worth effort. Love was work. Love was choosing someone every day, even when it got heavy. But as I read through his words, the truth finally uncoiled. I wasn't his partner. I was his landing pad, his recovery project, his emotional rehab center. He'd given me a promise ring 3 months ago. Not a proposal, just a promise. I'd cried when he slipped it on my finger, thinking it meant stability. But now, staring at the screen, I realized it had been guilt dressed as love. I felt the world tilt, not violently, just enough to make everything blurry. You know that feeling when something breaks quietly, when it doesn't shatter, it just stops working. That's what it felt like inside my chest. I didn't scream, didn't call him, didn't throw the laptop. I just closed the browser, sat back and let the silence wrap around me like a blanket that suddenly felt too heavy. That night, I opened Google Docs and typed the title, Exit Plan, and then I started writing. Screenshot every post, check archived messages, backup documents, change locks, cancel joint utilities, leave the ring. Each task typed with calm precision. No rage, no theatrics, just logic. I used to think heartbreak would sound like glass breaking, but sometimes it's quieter, like a mouse click in an empty apartment. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the page, waiting for more. Outside, rain began to fall soft and steady like punctuation marks on the end of something sacred. I leaned back, stared at the screen, and whispered to no one, I'm done. Then I saved the file, shut the laptop, and waited for morning for him to come home, for the world to pretend nothing had changed while I quietly planned to make sure everything did. When Alan came home the next morning, the first thing I noticed was how ordinary he looked. Hair slightly tousled, shirt half tucked in, eyes heavy, from what he probably called just one beer too many. He smiled when he saw me sitting at the kitchen table, coffee mug in hand. Morning, babe, he said, voice low and easy. Did you remember to pay the power bill? I looked up from the cup, watching steam curl between us, like the ghost of everything I hadn't said. Yeah, I answered. Paid it yesterday. He nodded, distracted, already scrolling through his phone as he leaned against the counter. I waited for even a flicker of guilt. Some sign that he felt what I'd seen the night before, but there was nothing. Just that casual, comfortable indifference that comes from knowing someone loves you enough to never leave. If he noticed the tightness in my smile, he didn't mention it. He walked past me, brushed a kiss against the top of my head, and said, "You're the best." I sat perfectly still as he disappeared down the hallway, and in that moment, something inside me stopped wanting to be his best anything. While he napped later, I moved like a shadow through our apartment. Quiet, efficient, unseen. It's strange how quickly the human heart can shift from devotion to detachment, how someone's laugh can still echo down the hall while you're packing your memories into boxes. I started with the drawers, the ones that held both of our lives tangled together. His old band t-shirts, the ones I'd folded for years, neatly stacked beside my sweaters. The smell of his cologne clung to the air, familiar and wrong, all at once. I took only what was mine: my clothes, my laptop, the books with my notes in the margins, the tiny ceramic cup I'd made in college. Everything else I left, his untouched. Then I opened his laptop again, not out of curiosity, out of confirmation. I needed to see if what I'd read was isolated, a slip of pain, maybe regret. It wasn't. Buried deep in his messenger archive below a string of grocery reminders and apartment chatter were messages from Sienna, the ex, the ghost he swore he'd buried. "You still cross my mind sometimes. She's good for you. Stable. You need that. You try so hard to love her. It's sweet." And his reply dated just 2 weeks after he'd given me that ring. "If you told me to come back, I would." That was all it took for the air to vanish from my lungs. I clicked print all, watched each page slide out of the printer like a confession I didn't ask for. The sound filled the apartment, small mechanical sighs, one after another. While the pages printed, I opened a folder on my computer titled Exit Plan. Inside, I created subfolders: screenshots, texts, receipts, lease transfer docs. The precision calmed me. Each step was a heartbeat, each file a reminder that this was no longer about heartbreak, it was about closure. At noon, I called my manager and said I had a family emergency. That wasn't a lie. When your relationship dies overnight and you're the only one attending the funeral, that's an emergency. Alan woke up briefly when I walked into the bedroom. He mumbled, "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said softly, zipping up my suitcase. "Everything's fine." He smiled, half asleep, unaware that every item leaving the apartment was another goodbye he'd never hear. By 3, I'd packed what was left of my life into the backseat of my car. By 4, I'd boxed up the rest, neatly, respectfully. On his nightstand, I placed the small velvet box that once held the promise ring he'd given me. Inside, I put the ring and a note. Just one line written in blue ink. "You were right. I was your safety net. Now the floor is yours." Behind it, I tucked the folder, printed screenshots, messenger logs, photos, and a letter of termination for the lease already signed. I didn't cry. I didn't break down. I wasn't the type of woman who needed an audience for her pain. At 4:15, I set the apartment keys in the mailbox, pressed send on the email to our landlord, and turned the ignition. No dramatic music, no chase, just quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like a door, closing somewhere deep inside you. As I drove away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror, because what was behind me wasn't home anymore, it was evidence. Evidence that I had loved someone who only ever wanted to be pitied. Evidence that I had mistaken endurance for devotion. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt steady. Empty, yes, but empty is how freedom begins. The first 24 hours of silence were the hardest. Not because I missed him, but because I was waiting for the noise. I knew Alan. He was predictable, the kind of man who couldn't stand not having the last word. So when my phone stayed still, no calls, no messages, I assumed he was trying to punish me with distance. It was his favorite game, wait for me to fold first. But by the second day, the notifications started. "Cindy, where are you? Why is all your stuff gone? What's this folder you left me? This isn't what you think." Then came the shift, the same rhythm I'd heard in every argument we ever had. Confusion first, then defensiveness, then guilt, then anger. "Those posts were jokes, Cindy. You're taking them too seriously. You violated my privacy. I can't believe you just left like that. Real mature." The irony almost made me laugh. He was furious not because of what he'd done, but because I'd seen it. I didn't respond, not once. I turned off read receipts, muted every app, and let my silence echo. The longer I stayed quiet, the louder his panic became. He called me dramatic, then cold, then manipulative. And finally, when none of it worked, he tried to sound broken. "Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. You know me, Cindy. You know I say dumb things when I'm frustrated. Can we just meet for coffee? Please. I didn't go. I didn't text. I didn't even block him. Blocking would have been too much engagement, too much acknowledgement. Instead, I did something worse. I disappeared completely. I moved into a small studio apartment across town, the kind with peeling wallpaper and a window that opened to an alley full of echoes. It wasn't pretty, but it was mine. No shared bills, no shared passwords, no shared air. In the quiet, I learned how to breathe again. I cooked for one, slept in the middle of the bed, stopped flinching when my phone buzzed. Every day, his voice faded a little more until it became nothing but background static. But the funny thing about silence is that people think it's weakness until it starts working. By the end of the first week, the messages slowed. Then they changed tone. You can't just ghost me like this. It's cruel. You owe me a conversation. This is emotional abuse, Cindy. He was weaponizing the very language I'd once used to defend him. It was always his pattern twist the story cast himself as the wounded one. Still, I said nothing. You learn a lot about people when you give them silence. You see what they do when the mirror stops flattering them. In the old days, I would have written back, explained, tried to reason with him, soothe him, save him from his own mess. But I'd spent too long being the woman who explained herself to people who'd already decided not to listen. Not anymore. I left my phone on the nightstand that night and stared at the ceiling, the faint sound of city traffic humming through the cracked window. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like ownership. Somewhere out there, Alan was unraveling, probably telling mutual friends half-truths about how I overreacted, maybe showing them the note I'd left pretending it was proof I'd lost my mind. But I didn't care, because silence, when you use it right, becomes truth's best translator. I remember reading somewhere that grief doesn't always come after death. Sometimes it shows up after clarity, when you finally realize the person you loved was just a lesson wearing a familiar face. I thought about that when I lay in bed that night, staring at the crack in my ceiling, shaped vaguely like a heart. I smiled, because maybe finally I understood what healing actually sounded like. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't revenge, it was the sound of nothing at all. It had been almost a month since I left when the message came. Not from Alan, that would have been too easy. This one was from Jason, one of his oldest friends. The kind of guy who always hovered at the edges of our relationship, polite, quiet, loyal to Alan by default. We never spoke much outside of birthdays and group dinners. So when his name popped up on my screen that night, I hesitated before opening it. Hey, Cindy, I know this is random. You probably don't want to hear from anyone connected to him right now, but you should see this. Attached was a screenshot, a private group chat between Alan, Jason, and a few of their mutual friends. The first message was from Alan. She ghosted me like I was nothing, after everything I did for her. Then another. She's unstable, man. She went through my stuff, printed things, left this dramatic note like some movie character. Total overreaction. Each line twisted the story, carefully rewritten so he could still be the good guy, the reliable one, the victim of an emotional woman who just couldn't handle reality. Jason didn't add commentary, but he didn't need to. The screenshot said enough. Below it, he'd written only one sentence. I saw the folder you left him. He showed it to us thinking we'd take his side. We didn't. My breath caught. You didn't, I typed back before I could stop myself. His reply came seconds later. No. Once we saw what he'd posted about you, the messages to Sienna, it was disgusting. You didn't deserve that, Cindy. I just wanted you to know I get it now. I stared at the words, the edges of the screen blurring slightly. Jason, the man who once laughed at Alan's jokes about sensitive women, was apologizing. Not for him, but for himself. Thank you, I wrote back. Nothing more. He heart-reacted to the message. And that was it. No long explanations, no promises of redemption. Just an acknowledgement, one that felt heavier than any apology Alan could have offered. It was strange. I'd spent weeks in silence, thinking my disappearance existed in a vacuum. But now I realized the silence had begun to echo in places I couldn't see. People were talking, not because I'd told my side, but because truth has a way of slipping through even the tightest lies. Over the next few days, small things started surfacing through mutual acquaintances. A mutual friend quietly unfollowed Alan. Another removed old photos. Someone else sent me a vague message. Good for you for getting out. I didn't reply to any of them. I didn't have to. The story was unraveling on its own. That's the thing about men like Alan, they survive on performance, on curating the narrative. The moment their mask slips, their audience vanishes. And he had slipped. He'd built his identity on being the nice guy who always gets hurt. But now, people had seen behind the curtain, and what they saw wasn't heartbreak, it was hypocrisy. I imagined him reading those chat messages in real time, watching his friend's silence stretch longer than usual, realizing too late that they weren't agreeing with him anymore. For the first time, I felt something close to pity. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry that people finally saw him for who he was. That night, I sat by the window of my tiny apartment, lights off, rain drumming softly against the glass. The city outside was a blur of yellow headlights and wet pavement. I thought about how peace doesn't always arrive, wrapped in happiness. Sometimes it comes disguised as distance. My phone buzzed again. Jason, one more message. For what it's worth, he's not taking it well. Keeps saying you ruined his life. But I think he's finally realizing he did that himself. I didn't respond. I didn't even smile. I just set the phone down and whispered to the dark. He's not the only one who realized something. Because what I realized sitting there under the soft hum of a city that didn't care was that I didn't need to fight for truth anymore. The story was no longer his to control. And maybe that was the real justice, watching him lose not just me, but the version of reality he'd built to keep himself safe. It wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. I poured myself a glass of wine, stared out the window, and let the rain drown out whatever echoes of him still lived in my head. For the first time, silence didn't feel like the absence of sound. It felt like the presence of peace. It was a Friday evening in early spring, the kind of day where everything looks deceptively calm. I had just finished grocery shopping, filling my cart with simple things, fruit, coffee, a new plant for my windowsill. The kind of quiet, ordinary errands that mark a new life. I was halfway across the parking lot when I saw him. Alan. He was leaning against a silver sedan a few rows away, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes fixed on me, like he'd been standing there for hours. The sight stopped me cold. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but in presence, like the world had finally caught up to the version of him he pretended to be. Cindy, he said, voice low, tentative. I didn't move closer. Just tightened my grip on the grocery bag and waited. He took a hesitant step forward. I wanted to talk. Please. There it was, that word. Please. He'd always used it like a key, expecting it to open every locked door. I didn't respond, so he filled the silence himself. You didn't even give me a chance to explain. My voice came out calm, flat. There's nothing to explain. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. It was stupid. I know. I was venting. You know how people talk online, exaggerating things for laughs. It didn't mean anything. I stared at him, letting the air stretch thin between us. You wrote that I was a practice run. A soft place to land. How's that funny, Alan? He blinked, words faltering. It was taken out of context. Your exact words were, she's nice to practice on until someone serious shows up. I stepped closer, then just enough for him to see that I remembered every syllable. What context makes that better? His jaw tightened. He looked around like he wanted to disappear into the pavement. I was frustrated. Okay, I felt trapped. I didn't know how to say I wasn't happy. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so painfully predictable. You didn't know how to say it, so you performed it for strangers. That's not honesty, Alan. That's cowardice dressed up as self-awareness. He flinched. For a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw it. The panic, the shame, the desperation to still be seen as the good guy. His voice softened. I made a mistake. One. And I've been paying for it ever since. No one talks to me anymore. I lost friends. My job's awkward now. Even Jason doesn't return my calls. Isn't that enough? I tilted my head, studying him. You didn't lose those things because of me. You lost them because people saw who you really were. That's not punishment, Alan. That's consequence. He swallowed hard, eyes glistening. Is there any part of you that still loves me? The question hung there like smoke. Once that would have gutted me. I would have clung to the possibility of reconciliation, tried to find softness in his regret. But now all I felt was distance. No, I said quietly. There's a part of me that pities you. But that's not love. His breath hitched, and for a second I thought he might cry. But he didn't. He just looked away the way people do when they're seeing the end for the first time. You didn't even fight for us, he said finally, his voice breaking on the last word. I adjusted the grocery bag in my hand, stepped around him and replied, No, I just stopped fighting myself to stay with you. I could feel his stare burning into my back as I walked away, but I didn't turn around, not once. When I reached my car, I set the bag down, exhaled, and closed my eyes for a moment. The late afternoon sun was sinking behind the lot, washing everything in gold. It felt like standing inside a final chapter 1 that didn't need an exclamation point, just a period. As I pulled out, I glanced once in the mirror. Alan was still standing there, motionless, the wind tugging at his shirt. For the first time, he looked like the thing he'd once accused me of being temporary. I drove home with the windows down. The air was cool, light, and unburdened. No tears, no shaking hands, no regret. Just peace, the quiet, steady kind that feels like justice. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window of my new apartment. The city glowed below like 1,000 untold stories. I thought about how people always imagine closure as a conversation, as if forgiveness requires both parties to agree on the ending. But sometimes closure is one person walking away while the other stays stuck in the scene. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. Time didn't heal anything at first. It just gave the pain fewer places to hide. But eventually the ache softened, not because I forgot, but because I stopped needing answers. I got a new apartment, one that smelled like paint and possibility. The walls were bare at first, and the nights were quiet enough to hear the neighbor's dog dreaming. But the stillness didn't scare me anymore. It felt earned. Work got better. I started running in the mornings, learned how to cook for one without feeling lonely about it. There were days when I still thought about him, not in longing, but in disbelief. How had I ever mistaken his chaos for passion, his pity for love? It's strange how clear everything looks once the storm has passed. You start seeing the patterns you ignored, the small lies, the half smiles, the way you kept shrinking yourself just to keep someone else comfortable. Alan's name still floated around sometimes. A friend of a friend would mention he'd left his job. Someone else said he'd moved back in with his parents for a while. I didn't ask for details, but people offered them anyway. Sienna, the woman he once claimed had ruined him for others, got married that summer. The news spread fast. She'd posted photos of a small ceremony by the lake, her smile untouched by guilt or nostalgia. Alan didn't take it well. That much I heard. He posted a vague quote on Instagram a few weeks later. Some people move on too fast, but karma never sleeps. It barely got any likes. Most of his old friends had already unfollowed him. Jason told me once casually in passing that Alan tried to twist the story one last time, telling people I'd manipulated him. But the screenshots I'd left behind told a different story, and people believed their own eyes. There was no dramatic downfall, no big public reckoning, just a slow, quiet unraveling. And that was enough. Sometimes the worst punishment isn't humiliation, it's exposure, the kind that leaves no audience left to applaud you. I never made a post about what happened, never shared my side online. The proof was there for anyone who needed it, and the rest. I left in silence, because silence, when it belongs to you, becomes power. Months passed, seasons changed. One evening, I found myself walking through the same grocery store parking lot where it all ended. The air smelled like rain, the pavement still warm from the sun. For a second, I half expected to see him standing there again, hands in pockets, rehearsing apologies. But the lot was empty. Just me, a cart, and the echo of a story that no longer needed telling. I smiled. Not the kind you fake for cameras, but the quiet one that sneaks up on you when you realize you've finally let go. Love isn't supposed to feel like survival, and leaving isn't failure sometimes, it's the only honest thing left to do. That night back home, I opened my old laptop. The folder labeled Exit Plan was still there. I hovered over it for a moment, then hit delete. No hesitation, no ceremony, just a soft click and it was gone. I closed the lid, turned off the lights, and let the darkness settle, not heavy this time, but peaceful. Some people think revenge has to be loud, explosive, a spectacle. But sometimes the most devastating revenge is to simply disappear so completely that they can't tell the story without you. Because one day they'll hear the silence and realize it was never their stage, it was your life, and they've been written out.